The air in the grand ballroom of the Astoria shimmered with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of ambition. Among the city's elite, one voice slick with arrogance cut through the noise. It belonged to Ethan Hayes. He was holding court, a champagne flute in one hand and his other arm draped possessively around a woman who seemed sculpted from starlight and Instagram filters. Honestly, he declared, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "It's like trading in a used sedan for a brand new Ferrari. My new wife Tiffany, she's flawless, an upgrade in every conceivable way." A few people chuckled uncomfortably. He was of course talking about his ex-wife Clara. And as he spoke, he had no idea that the used sedan he so carelessly mocked was about to pull up driven by a man who owned the entire car company. Ethan Hayes felt like he was on top of the world, and he wanted everyone to know it. The Starlight Foundation Gala was the pinnacle of the social season, a place to see and be seen, and tonight he was the main event. Or so he believed. His new wife Tiffany was his ultimate accessory. With her platinum blonde hair, surgically perfected features, and a glittering silver dress that clung to her like a second skin, she was a living testament to his success. She smiled a perfect practice smile as Ethan continued his monologue. "You know how it is," Ethan said to Mark and Sarah Jensen, a couple who had been friends with both him and Clara for years. "You get comfortable. You let things slide. Clara got very comfortable. The yoga pants became a uniform, the messy bun her signature look. Her passion was restoring old dusty paintings in that dark little studio of hers. Smelled of turpentine all the time." He chuckled as if sharing a fond but pathetic memory. Sarah Jensen shifted in her seat, her wine glass suddenly feeling very heavy. "Clara was brilliant at her work, Ethan. She had a gift." "A hobby, Sarah. A messy hobby that paid next to nothing," Ethan corrected her, waving his hand dismissively. "I needed a partner who could stand with me in the spotlight, not someone hiding behind a canvas. Tiffany understands that. She's an influencer, a brand. She has 500,000 followers who hang on her every word about skincare and luxury travel. She adds value." Tiffany preened, tilting her head. "It's all about synergy, darling," she cooed, her voice as smooth and sweet as honey. "A power couple needs to project power. Image is everything." Mark, who had always found Ethan's ambition a bit grating, finally spoke up. "And Clara, how is she? We haven't heard from her in a while." Ethan smirked a cruel, self-satisfied expression. "Honestly, I have no idea. Probably holed up in some tiny apartment covered in paint dust, wondering where it all went wrong. I did her a favor, really. Set her free to pursue her art." The condescension in his tone was thick enough to cut with a knife. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for everyone to hear. "Between us, the spark was long gone. It's tough to feel desire for someone who has the same energy as a comfortable old sweater. I needed silk. I needed haute couture." He squeezed Tiffany's waist. "And I got it." Tiffany giggled, a sound like tiny tinkling bells. The Jensens exchanged a pained look. They remembered a different Ethan, a younger man, who had looked at Clara as if she held the sun and moon in her eyes. They remembered how Clara's quiet intelligence and steady support had been the bedrock on which Ethan built his real estate empire. He hadn't started at the top. She had been with him in the tiny apartment, eating ramen noodles and dreaming of a better future. She had designed his first business logo, proofread his proposals, and celebrated every small victory as if it were her own. He had conveniently forgotten all of that. As Ethan launched into another story, this one about Tiffany's recent photo shoot in Monaco, a subtle shift occurred in the ballroom's atmosphere. It started at the grand entrance. The low murmur of conversation near the doors faltered, replaced by a wave of hushed whispers that spread through the room like a ripple in a pond. Heads began to turn. A palpable sense of importance had just entered the space, a gravity that pulled all attention toward it. Ethan, annoyed at losing his audience, turned to see what the commotion was about. And that's when his world tilted on its axis. Framed by the grand archway of the ballroom entrance stood a woman. For a moment, Ethan didn't recognize her. This woman was a vision of understated elegance and radiant confidence. She wore a deep emerald gown, a simple classic cut that didn't scream for attention but commanded it nonetheless. It flowed around her a river of dark silk. Her hair, which he remembered as a perpetually hurried bun, was styled in soft cascading waves that framed a face he almost didn't know. The tired lines of stress around her eyes were gone, replaced by a serene sparkle. Her smile wasn't the wide, people-pleasing grin he recalled, but a small, self-assured curve of her lips. It was Clara. Ethan's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. A strangled noise escaped his throat. Tiffany, sensing his sudden tension, followed his gaze. Her perfect smile tightened at the edges. "Who is that?" She hissed, a note of pure venom in her voice. But it wasn't just Clara that held the room's attention. Standing beside her, with a hand resting lightly on the small of her back, was a man who exuded an aura of quiet, unassailable power. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with distinguished silver hair at his temples and eyes that seemed to assess the entire room in a single sweeping glance. He wore a bespoke tuxedo with the casual ease of a man born to it. He wasn't handsome in the flashy, gem-sculpted way Ethan prided himself on. He was magnetic, his presence a force of nature. Whispers erupted around them. "Is that?" "It can't be." "That's Julian Devereaux." The name hung in the air electric. Julian Devereaux wasn't just rich, he was a legend. A reclusive titan of industry, a tech mogul who had transitioned into global investments. His net worth was a figure so vast it was spoken of in terms of national GDPs. He rarely made public appearances. To see him here was a coup for the Starlight Foundation. To see him with Clara. It was incomprehensible. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic trapped bird. This couldn't be happening. Clara, his mousy, paint-stained ex-wife, was on the arm of a billionaire. It had to be a mistake. A fluke. Maybe she was his assistant. A caterer he'd spoken to on the way in. His desperate rationalizations shattered when Victoria Davenport, the formidable chairwoman of the foundation, and the evening's host swept past their table without a glance and approached the new arrivals. "Julian, we are so honored you could make it," Victoria gushed, embracing him warmly before turning to Clara with a genuine, admiring smile. "And you must be Clara Vance. Julian has told me so much about you. That gown is absolutely breathtaking on you." Clara's voice, when she replied, was calm and clear. "Thank you, Victoria. It's a beautiful event." There was no stutter, no social anxiety, none of the awkwardness Ethan remembered. This was a woman completely at ease, completely in her element. As the trio spoke, a photographer from a society magazine cautiously approached. Julian Devereaux was famously photo-shy. But as the photographer raised his camera, Julian simply smiled, drawing Clara a fraction closer. The flashbulb popped, capturing the moment for eternity. Julian Devereaux, the untouchable billionaire with the radiant Clara Vance on his arm. Back at Ethan's table, the silence was deafening. Tiffany's perfectly manicured nails were digging into her own arm. "Ethan, what is going on?" she demanded through clenched teeth. "How does your frumpy ex-wife know Julian Devereaux?" Ethan couldn't answer. He was watching Clara laugh at something Julian said, a genuine musical laugh that he hadn't heard in years. He felt a bizarre, unwelcome pang of something that felt dangerously like loss. But it was quickly replaced by a hot, searing wave of humiliation and rage. She was doing this to spite him. This was all an elaborate performance designed to make him look like a fool. And it was working. Everyone who had been listening to him brag just minutes ago was now staring, their expressions a mixture of shock and pity. His Ferrari suddenly felt like a cheap replica sitting next to a custom-built Rolls-Royce. The spotlight he craved had found him, but instead of illuminating his glory, it was burning him to ashes. To understand the woman who walked into the Astoria, one had to understand the woman who had walked out of her marriage 2 years prior. The divorce had not been a mutual, amicable parting. It had been an amputation performed without anesthetic. Ethan's final words to her had been a masterclass in casual cruelty. They were in their minimalist white-on-white living room, a space that had always felt more like his showroom than their home. "It's just not working, Clara," he'd said, avoiding her eyes. "I'm moving forward and you're standing still. This business with the paintings, the dust, the mess, it's not the life I want." "It's my career, Ethan," she had whispered, her voice trembling. "It's my passion. It's a dead end," he'd countered, his voice flat and final. "I need someone who shines, someone who compliments me. We've grown apart." He had made it sound so simple, so logical, as if their 15-year relationship was a line item on a balance sheet that was no longer profitable. He had already met Tiffany, though he denied it at the time. The truth came out later in sanitized legal documents and gossipy whispers from mutual friends. He left Clara with the house they had shared, a calculated gesture that seemed generous, but was actually a burden, its mortgage payments a constant reminder of the life and income that had just vanished. The first 6 months were a blur of grief and inertia. The silence in the big empty house was a physical presence. She would wander from room to room, a ghost in her own life, surrounded by memories that now felt like lies. She stopped going to her studio. The smell of turpentine and oil paint, once a source of comfort, now only reminded her of Ethan's derision. His voice was a constant echo in her head, a messy hobby, a dead end. Her confidence, which had been slowly eroded over years of subtle digs and overt criticisms, was completely shattered. She had poured so much of herself into being Ethan's partner, his support system, that she had forgotten who she was without him. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She was packing up old boxes, intending to sell the house and move somewhere smaller, somewhere anonymous. In one box, she found her old university portfolio. Tucked inside was a glowing letter of recommendation from her favorite professor, Dr. Alistair Finch. "Miss Vance possesses a rare and intuitive eye," he had written. "She doesn't just see the paint on the canvas. She sees the history, the intention, the soul of the artist. She has the potential for true greatness in the field of art conservation." Reading those words felt like a jolt of electricity. It was a voice from her past, reminding her of a time before Ethan, a time when she was defined not by her relationship but by her talent. That afternoon she didn't pack any more boxes. Instead, she went to her studio, opened the windows to let out the stale air, and uncovered a half-finished project, a small dark 17th century portrait from a local estate sale that she had bought for a pittance. She began to work. Slowly at first, then with a growing obsessive focus. The work became her meditation, her therapy, her salvation. The meticulous process of cleaning away centuries of grime, of analyzing brushstrokes, of researching pigments, it was a process of restoration, not just for the painting but for herself. She was scraping away the layers of doubt and insecurity that Ethan had plastered over her, rediscovering the vibrant, confident woman beneath. As she worked on the portrait, she noticed an anomaly. A tiny, almost invisible detail in the lace collar of the subject. It was a specific cross-hatching technique, a signature that was rumored to belong to a student of Rembrandt. A brilliant but obscure artist named Gerard van Honthorst, most of whose early works were thought to be lost. Fueled by a surge of academic excitement she hadn't felt in years, she dove into research. She spent weeks in museum archives and university libraries, cross-referencing documents and using advanced imaging techniques she borrowed from a friend at the local university. Finally, she found a mention in a 17th century shipping manifest of a small portrait of a merchant's wife by Van Honthorst with dimensions that matched her painting perfectly. She had uncovered a lost masterpiece. She wrote a paper, scholarly and precise, and submitted it to the Art Conservation Journal. It was published to immediate acclaim. The art world was small and insular, and the news spread like wildfire. A small gallery owner who specialized in Dutch masters contacted her. He wanted to see the painting. Clara, nervous but determined, met with him. He was impressed not just by the discovery but by her deep, passionate knowledge. He helped her get the piece authenticated by the world's leading experts. The painting, which she had bought for $200, was now valued at over $3 million. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the validation. Her messy hobby was a legitimate, valuable skill. She had done this on her own. The discovery put her on the map. Commissions started to come in. Museums sought her consultation. And one day she received a call from an assistant to a private collector who had a piece he wanted her to examine. The collector was notoriously private. He would meet her at his private gallery in his city penthouse. The collector was Julien Devereaux. When they met, he wasn't what she expected. He was quiet, intensely intelligent, and listened with a focused stillness that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. He didn't just see the value of his art in dollars. He loved the stories, the history, the human hands that had created it. He was captivated by Clara's ability to read a canvas like a book. He showed her a painting from his collection, a beautiful landscape that was attributed to a lesser-known artist. "My experts are certain," he said, "but I've always felt something was off. It feels grander, more significant." Clara spent an hour with the painting, her eyes tracing every detail. Then she turned to him. "It is," she said softly. "Look at the way the light hits the water, and the composition of the clouds. This isn't the work of one artist. It's a collaboration. The landscape is by the artist of record, but the sky was painted by his teacher, a master. You have two great artists on one canvas." Julien stared at her, then at the painting, and a slow smile spread across his face. No one had ever seen that before. From that moment, a partnership was born. He hired her to be the private curator and conservator for his entire world-class collection. He gave her a state-of-the-art laboratory and an unlimited budget. But more than that, he gave her respect. He saw her brilliance, her passion, and he valued it. A deep friendship blossomed, which over time deepened into something more. He wasn't a replacement for Ethan. He was the antithesis of him. Where Ethan had sought to diminish her, Julien sought to elevate her. So when she walked into the Starlight Gala, she wasn't putting on a performance. She wasn't Clara Hayes, the discarded wife. She was Clara Vance, a leading expert in her field, a respected professional, and a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ashes stronger and more radiant than before. The emerald gown and the billionaire on her arm weren't the source of her confidence. They were merely the reflection of a confidence she had painstakingly rediscovered on her own. The gala's atmosphere had fractured into two distinct zones. The first was a vibrant, buzzing nexus of energy around Julien Devereaux and Clara Vance. The city's mayor, a state senator, and the heads of several Fortune 500 companies formed a polite but persistent circle around them. They spoke of art, of philanthropy, of global markets. Clara, far from being a silent accessory, contributed intelligently to the conversation, discussing the cultural significance of art preservation with an eloquence that captivated everyone. The second zone, where Ethan and Tiffany were seated, was a dead sea of social isolation. The people who had been laughing at Ethan's jokes just 20 minutes ago now avoided his gaze, their discomfort palpable. They would offer tight, polite smiles if he caught their eye, then quickly turn away to whisper to their companions. Ethan had become a social pariah in the space of a single entrance. Tiffany was a coiled spring of fury. Her entire self-worth was pegged to public perception, and right now they were perceived as fools. "Do something, Ethan!" She hissed, her voice a low, dangerous growl that was a world away from her public persona. "Go over there. Talk to her. Show everyone that you're not bothered." "What am I supposed to say?" Ethan snapped back, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and sweat. "I don't know. Congratulate her. Be condescending. Act like you're the bigger person. Just don't sit here looking like a pathetic, rejected idiot," she retorted. Her carefully constructed mask was crumbling, revealing the cold, hard ambition beneath. She hadn't married Ethan for love. She had married him for the status he provided, and he was currently failing spectacularly at providing it. Goaded by her venom and his own spiraling ego, Ethan stood up. He straightened his tie, plastered a fake smile on his face, and began to walk toward Clara's group. It felt like the longest walk of his life. Every eye in the room was on him. He reached the edge of the circle just as the mayor was shaking Clara's hand. "Ms. Vance, it's a pleasure. Your work is truly remarkable." Ethan saw his opening. He stepped forward, his voice overly loud and dripping with false charm. "Clara, I almost didn't recognize you. You clean up nice." The conversation stopped. A dozen pairs of eyes turned to him. The crudeness of his comment hung in the air like a foul odor. Clara's serene expression didn't change, but a flicker of old sadness quickly extinguished passed through her eyes. Before she could respond, Julian Devereaux turned his head slightly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply looked at Ethan, a gaze so cold and dismissive it was like being entombed in ice. "I'm sorry," Julian said, his voice a quiet baritone that carried more weight than a shout. "I don't believe we've been introduced, and I believe Ms. Vance is in the middle of a conversation." It was a complete and utter shutdown. He hadn't acknowledged Ethan's name or his history with Clara. He had dismissed him as a nameless, irrelevant interruption. The mayor coughed awkwardly and resumed his conversation with Clara, turning his back on Ethan. The circle closed once more, leaving Ethan standing alone on the outside, utterly humiliated. He retreated to his table, his face a mask of thunder. "Well, that went well," Tiffany sneered, taking a large gulp of her champagne. "You look like a child who was just sent to his room." "Shut up, Tiffany," he growled. "No, you shut up." She shot back, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "I attached my brand to yours, Ethan. I thought you were a winner. But that woman," she nodded toward Clara, "just made you look like a fool without saying a single word, and her boyfriend could buy you and sell you 100 times over before breakfast. You told me she was a nobody. You told me she was pathetic. You lied." Ethan had no response. He stared across the room at his ex-wife, who was now being led to the head table, the guest of honor alongside Julian Devereaux and the gala's chairwoman. He had spent 2 years telling himself and everyone else that he had won the divorce, that he had upgraded. But in the harsh, unforgiving light of that ballroom, he was forced to confront a terrifying truth: he hadn't just lost Clara. He had discarded a priceless treasure he had been too blind and too arrogant to recognize. And now the entire world could see its value. Later in the evening, after the main course had been served, Victoria Davenport stepped up to the podium on stage. A hush fell over the grand ballroom. The clinking of cutlery ceased, and all faces turned toward the front. Ethan sat rigidly in his chair, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He felt a premonition that the evening's humiliation was not yet complete. "Good evening, everyone," Victoria began, her voice warm and commanding. "On behalf of the Starlight Foundation, I want to thank you all for your incredible generosity tonight. Your donations will allow us to continue our vital work supporting underprivileged children with arts education." She went on to thank various sponsors and committee members. Ethan barely heard her. His eyes were locked on Clara, seated at the head table. She looked poised, listening intently, occasionally nodding or smiling at something Julian whispered to her. She seemed to belong there. It was that sense of belonging that galled him the most. "Tonight, however," Victoria continued, her voice rising with excitement, "we have a very special announcement. We are often blessed with generosity, but rarely are we gifted with a vision that will transform our community for generations to come." A murmur of anticipation went through the crowd. This year, one of our guests was not content to simply write a check. He saw a need, a way to build a lasting legacy. It is my profound honor to announce the single largest donation in the history of the Starlight Foundation, a pledge of $25 million from Mr. Julian Devereaux. The ballroom erupted in a tidal wave of applause and gasps of astonishment. People rose to their feet, craning their necks to get a better look at the man who had just casually committed a fortune. Julian simply inclined his head, a gesture of humble acknowledgement, and gently squeezed Clara's hand under the table. Ethan felt sick. $25 million. It was more than his entire net worth. But Victoria held up her hands, signaling that she wasn't finished. "But that," she said, her smile widening, "is not all. Mr. Devereaux's donation comes with a purpose. It is the seed money for an extraordinary new project. In partnership with the Metropolitan Museum, the Devereaux Foundation will be funding the construction of a new state-of-the-art wing, the Devereaux Center for Art Conservation and Historical Research. Another wave of applause, even more thunderous this time. Ethan's mind was reeling. A museum wing named after him. This center will not only house some of the world's most advanced restoration technology, Victoria boomed, her voice filled with passion, but it will also serve as a premier educational institution training the next generation of conservators. It will be a beacon for art lovers and historians worldwide. And a project of this magnitude requires a leader with unparalleled vision, skill, and integrity. Ethan knew what was coming. He felt it in his bones, a cold, creeping certainty that the final killing blow was about to be delivered. Victoria turned her beaming gaze directly to Clara. The board of the museum, along with Mr. Devereaux, conducted an international search for a director to helm this incredible initiative. They sought the best, a mind brilliant enough to lead and hands skilled enough to preserve our most precious cultural treasures. And they found her. It is my immense pleasure to announce that the inaugural director and head curator of the Devereaux Center will be a woman whose recent discovery of a lost Van Honthorst masterpiece has already made her a legend in the art world. Please join me in congratulating Ms. Clara Vance. For a moment there was stunned silence. Then the room exploded. The applause was deafening, a roar of acclaim and respect. Every single person was on their feet, their applause directed at the woman Ethan had called a comfortable old sweater. Clara, visibly moved, rose to her feet. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but her smile was luminous. Julian stood beside her, his pride in her evident to everyone. At his table, Ethan felt like he couldn't breathe. The sound of the applause was a physical assault. It was the sound of his own irrelevance. It wasn't just that Clara was with a billionaire. It wasn't just that she looked beautiful. It was that her success was entirely her own. Julian Devereaux hadn't just given her a lifestyle. He had recognized her talent, the very talent Ethan had mocked and dismissed, and had given her a global stage on which to display it. He had built a kingdom and handed her the crown. Tiffany stared straight ahead, her face as pale and hard as marble. She slowly pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. She picked up her tiny diamond-encrusted clutch from the table. "Where are you going?" Ethan managed to croak. She turned to him, and for the first time he saw her without any artifice. Her eyes were filled with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "I'm going to congratulate Ms. Vance," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "It's called networking. You should try it sometime. Oh, and Ethan, I'll have my lawyer contact yours in the morning. I don't associate my brand with failures." She turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving Ethan utterly and completely alone at a table for four, surrounded by the thunderous sound of his ex-wife's triumph. The rest of the evening passed in a haze for Ethan. He sat through the dessert course, the charity auction, and the closing remarks, all while nursing a glass of scotch that did nothing to numb the gaping wound in his ego. He watched as Tiffany seamlessly integrated herself into a group of investors, laughing and flirting as if he had never existed. He watched as a seemingly endless stream of people approached Clara and Julian's table to offer their congratulations. He knew he should leave. He knew the smart thing to do was to slip out a side door and lick his wounds in private. But a toxic cocktail of alcohol rage and a desperate need for some kind of final say kept him rooted to his chair. He needed to confront her. He needed to say something, anything, to reassert the power dynamic he had so long taken for granted. He found his chance as the gala began to wind down. Guests were starting to retrieve their coats. He saw Julian get pulled into a conversation with a senator, leaving Clara standing alone for a moment near the grand terrace doors, looking out at the glittering city skyline. This was it. He walked up behind her, his steps unsteady. "Quite a night," he said, his voice raspy. Clara turned, her expression calm, though he could see her brace herself. "Ethan, so this is your big revenge plot. he sneered, foregoing any pretense of civility. "Find the richest, most powerful man in the city and have him build you a monument. How much did it cost you? What did you have to do to get him to fund your little hobby shop?" The insult, so similar to the ones he used to throw at her in the privacy of their home, no longer had the power to wound her. She simply looked at him, not with anger, but with a profound and weary sadness. "You still don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice quiet. "This was never about you. My work, my success, none of it has anything to do with you." "Oh, please," he scoffed, his voice rising. "You think I'm an idiot? You walk in here dripping in couture on the arm of a billionaire with a new job title he bought for you. This is a performance, and I'm the intended audience." "The only performance I see tonight, Ethan, is yours," she countered, her voice remaining steady. "The performance of the man so terrified of his own mediocrity that he has to tear everyone else down. You thought I was a reflection of you. When I was frumpy and tired, it meant you were settling. Now that I'm successful, you think it's an attack on you. But I was never your reflection. I was always my own person. You were just too busy looking in the mirror to notice." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow because he knew deep down that they were true. He had needed her to be small so that he could feel big. He lashed out, his last resort, the ugliest accusation he could think of. "You're a gold digger, Clara. You always were. You just traded up to a bigger mine." Before Clara could even respond, a calm voice spoke from behind Ethan. "That's quite enough." Ethan spun around to find Julian Devereaux standing there. He hadn't raised his voice, but his presence was immense, an unmovable object of sheer authority. He looked at Ethan not with anger, but with something far more damning pity. "Mr. Hayes," Julian said, his eyes cold and analytical. "For a man who deals in real estate, you have a remarkably poor understanding of value. You had a masterpiece in your home for 15 years, and you treated it like a cheap print because you lacked the sophistication to recognize its worth. You didn't trade up. You liquidated your most valuable asset for a liability with a nice facade. A very, very bad investment." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Clara's position," he continued, his tone turning to steel, "was awarded to her by a unanimous vote from the museum's Acquisitions and Conservation Board, of which I am only one of 7 members. She earned it with her talent, her dedication, and her brilliance. The very qualities you were too blind to see. I didn't give her a crown. I simply provided a vault worthy of the treasure she already was." Julian then did the one thing that crushed Ethan more than any threat could have. He dismissed him entirely. He turned to Clara, his expression softening. "Are you ready to go, my dear? It's been a long evening." "Yes," Clara said, giving Ethan one last pitying look. As Julian placed a protective hand on her back and guided her away, Ethan was left standing alone on the terrace, the cool night air feeling like a shroud. He had come here tonight to brag, to show the world how much he had won. Instead, he had been forced to witness in the most public and humiliating way imaginable the true measure of what he had so carelessly thrown away. He wasn't the winner. He was the fool of the story, the punchline of a joke he had written himself. The fallout from the Starlight Foundation Gala was swift and brutal. The society pages and gossip blogs were merciless. Photos of Clara and Julian were splashed across every screen, their story framed as a modern fairy tale. Juxtaposed against them were photos of Ethan looking stunned and foolish, and Tiffany captured in a mid-conversation sneer as she abandoned him. The narrative was clear: the arrogant ex-husband had received his comeuppance. Tiffany, true to her word, had her lawyer serve him with divorce papers within the week. Their split was messy and public, with her leaking stories to the press about his financial insecurities and his obsessive bitterness towards his ex-wife. Her brand, ever adaptable, repositioned itself from power couple to empowered woman escaping toxic masculinity. Ethan's professional life suffered as well. In a city where perception is currency, he was now perceived as a joke. Deals that had been all but certain suddenly stalled. Potential partners became unavailable. The quiet, dismissive judgment he had received from Julian Devereaux seemed to echo in the boardrooms and business lunches he attended. He had built his empire on an image of ruthless success, but that image was now tarnished by the stain of public humiliation. He found himself isolated. The fair-weather friends who had flocked to his side when he was with Tiffany now kept their distance. Mark and Sarah Jensen stopped returning his calls. He was left in his sterile white-on-white house, a space that now felt less like a monument to his success and more like a mausoleum for his failed relationships. Months later, driven by a desperate, pathetic impulse, he drove to the Metropolitan Museum. Construction on the new Devereaux Center was well underway, a massive gleaming structure of glass and steel being grafted onto the historic stone building. He saw a sign out front, a temporary placeholder for the grand opening. It read, "The Devereaux Center for Art Conservation, Dr. Clara Vance, Director." Dr. Clara Vance. He hadn't even known she'd completed her doctorate online during the last few years of their marriage, squeezing in study time late at night after he'd gone to bed, dismissing her typing as more time wasted on her hobby. Meanwhile, Clara thrived. She moved out of the house they had shared and into a beautiful apartment overlooking Central Park, a space filled with light books and the comforting scent of her work. Her days were a whirlwind of activity, overseeing construction, acquiring new pieces for the museum, hiring staff, and teaching master classes to university students. She was respected, admired, and for the first time in a long time, deeply happy. Her relationship with Julian was nothing like her marriage to Ethan. It was a true partnership built on a foundation of mutual admiration and shared passions. They traveled the world not for photo shoots, but to visit obscure monasteries with forgotten frescoes and private collections hidden from public view. He celebrated her intellect, and she was grounded by his wisdom. It was a quiet, profound love far more valuable than the loud, performative affection Ethan had demanded. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after the gala, Clara stood in her nearly completed office at the center. The main laboratory was visible through a large glass wall, already filled with advanced equipment. She was unwrapping a small, unassuming painting she had personally acquired for the collection. Julian entered quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee. He didn't speak, just stood beside her watching her work. Her hands moved with a surgeon's precision and an artist's grace as she examined the canvas. "What do you see?" he asked softly. Clara smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "I see a story," she said, her gaze fixed on the painting. Someone tried to cover it up, paint over it with something more conventional. They were probably afraid of its brilliance, but underneath all that grime and doubt, the masterpiece is still there. It just needs a little patience and the right hands to bring it back into the light. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and full of a quiet strength he so admired. In that moment, it was clear she wasn't just talking about the painting. She was talking about herself. She had finally restored her own masterpiece. 3 years passed. The world, as it always does, moved on. The story of Ethan Hayes' spectacular fall from grace at the Starlight Gala became a piece of city lore, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties before being replaced by newer, more immediate scandals. The Devereaux Center for Art Conservation was now a celebrated institution, a jewel of the New York art scene. Dr. Clara Devereaux, as she was now known after marrying Julian in a quiet ceremony in Tuscany, was one of the most respected figures in her field. Her name was synonymous with integrity and a preternatural talent for uncovering the hidden stories within a canvas. One rain-slicked evening in November, Clara and Julian sat in the front row at a major Christie's auction. The room was tense with the electric thrill of immense wealth preparing to do battle. They were there for a specific piece, a Renaissance-era preparatory drawing that Clara believed was the key to understanding a larger work in the museum's collection. Julian was not there as a bidder, but as a silent partner, his hand resting lightly on his wife's arm, his presence a quiet bastion of support. Clara was in her element. She held her bidder's paddle with an easy confidence, her eyes trained to see the finest details scanning the room and the artwork on display. She was happy, a deep, resonant contentment that had become the baseline of her existence. About an hour into the auction, after a fierce bidding war over a Monet, there was a brief lull. The next lot was a collection of minor 19th-century American landscapes. As the auctioneer introduced the pieces, an assistant in a standard-issue black suit walked onto the stage to adjust the lighting on one of the easels. He moved with a practiced efficiency, his head bowed to his task. From her seat, Clara felt a strange, inexplicable jolt of recognition in the man's posture, in the line of his shoulders. She watched as he finished his task and turned to walk off the stage. He briefly lifted his head to scan the room, his gaze professional and detached. And for a single breath-stopping second, his eyes met hers. It was Ethan. The 3 years had not been kind. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. He was thinner, and the sharp lines of his expensive suits had been replaced by the ill-fitting drape of a uniform. The fiery ambition in his eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind the dull, banked embers of a man just getting through the day. He was a floor manager, a mid-level employee in a world where he had once been a king. Time seemed to slow, the auctioneer's voice fading into a distant drone. For Ethan, seeing Clara was like being struck by lightning. She wasn't just beautiful, she radiated a powerful serenity that seemed to emanate from her very core. The woman he had called a comfortable old sweater now possessed a grace and poise that made every other woman in the room look garish by comparison. He saw Julian beside her, not hovering possessively, but watching her with an expression of pure, unadulterated admiration. He was witnessing a true partnership, a harmony he had never even known how to seek. In that single, silent glance, the last vestiges of Ethan's bitterness dissolved, replaced by a regret so profound it was a physical ache in his chest. He finally understood. His loss wasn't the money, the status, or the connection to Julian Devereux. His loss was Clara herself. He had held a universe of brilliance, warmth and quiet strength in his hands, and in his ignorance had let it all slip through his fingers like sand. For Clara, the moment was different. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfying sting of revenge. The man on the stage was a ghost from another life, a stranger who happened to wear a familiar face. The anger and hurt he had caused had long since faded, processed, and put away like a restored painting placed carefully into archival storage. Looking at him now, she felt only a distant clinical pity. He was simply a man who had made a series of poor choices and was now living with their consequences. As he began to turn away, his face pale with shock, Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a greeting. It was not an offer of forgiveness or an invitation to reconnect. It was a final acknowledgement, a quiet, definitive closing of the last page of their shared history. It meant, I see you. I remember. And I have moved on. Ethan understood the gesture perfectly. It was not an act of cruelty, but one of finality. It was the release he never knew he needed. He turned and walked off the stage, disappearing behind the heavy velvet curtain. Julian, who had witnessed the silent exchange, gently squeezed his wife's hand. "Are you all right?" he murmured, his voice for her ears only. Clara turned to him, her eyes clear and present. She gave him a soft smile, full of love and gratitude for the life they had built. "I'm perfect," she said. She straightened her back, her focus returning to the auctioneer. The next lot, the Renaissance drawing she had come for, was being introduced. With a steady hand, she raised her paddle, ready to bid on the future. A decade can erase a city's memory. Scandals fade into anecdotes, titans of industry become footnotes, and the relentless pulse of New York life creates new dramas to replace the old. On a bright spring afternoon, 15 years after the Starlight Gala, a young woman named Dr. Maya Santos stood before a group of benefactors in the sunlit atrium of the Devereux Center. She was the new director of conservation, a position she had inherited a year prior. With dark, intelligent eyes and hands that moved with the quiet certainty of a master, she commanded the room. "This piece," she said, gesturing to a newly restored Baroque masterpiece, "is a lesson in seeing beyond the surface. For centuries it was believed to be a minor work darkened by time and neglect. It was hidden, you see. But Dr. Devereaux taught me the first rule of conservation: you must have the courage to believe in the value that others have dismissed. An elderly man in the front row, a new board member, raised his hand. Dr. Devereaux. Of course her reputation is legendary. You were her protege for many years, weren't you? What was the most important thing she taught you? A warm, genuine smile touched Maya's lips. Patience, she said. And that the most valuable things are never the loudest. She also taught me that sometimes the act of restoration itself is what saves you. After the presentation, as the donors mingled, Maya walked through the gleaming halls of the center. This place was more than a museum to her. It was a testament to a single night she had never witnessed but which had irrevocably shaped her life. She had been a 12-year-old girl in a cramped Bronx apartment back then, a girl who sketched on scrap paper and dreamed of colors she couldn't afford. Her future was a narrow, predetermined path until her art teacher helped her apply for a new scholarship. It was a long shot, a brand new arts education fund for underprivileged children, established by the Starlight Foundation. The scholarship was funded by an unprecedented, anonymous $25 million donation. It changed everything. It paid for art supplies, then for summer programs, and eventually for a university education she had never thought possible. It set her on a path that led her directly to this building, to the mentorship of the woman whose quiet work and life-changing decision had unknowingly made it all possible. She reached a quiet wing of the museum, a private study overlooking a garden. Inside, Clara and Julian were sitting together on a small sofa, looking at a book of architectural designs. The silver in Clara's hair caught the afternoon light, and the lines around her eyes were maps of a life filled with laughter and purpose. Julian, now fully retired, was her constant companion, their bond a silent, easy poetry. Clara looked up as Maya entered, her eyes bright with affection. "Maya, how did it go?" "They were very impressed," Maya reported. "Mr. Henderson asked what you taught me." "And what did you tell him?" Julian asked, a twinkle in his eye. "The truth," Maya said. "That you taught me to see." Clara smiled, a gentle, knowing expression. Her gaze drifted past Maya through the large window to the city beyond. Her legacy wasn't just in the priceless art she had saved. It was here in this young woman's brilliance. It was in the thousands of children who had passed through the Starlight Foundation's program, over the years their lives altered by a chain of events set in motion by one man's cruelty and one woman's resilience. Ethan's insult all those years ago had been that she was a comfortable old sweater. He wasn't entirely wrong. He just never understood that the purpose of a sweater isn't to be flashy or new, but to provide warmth. Clara's life, rebuilt from the ashes of his ego, had become a source of warmth and light for so many, a quiet, enduring masterpiece whose true value could never be contained in a single frame. So what is the moral of this incredible story? Is it about revenge? Is it about a woman finding a richer, more powerful man? No. The real story is so much deeper than that. It's a powerful reminder that true value isn't determined by someone else's opinion. Ethan saw Clara as an accessory to his life, and when she no longer fit his brand, he discarded her. But he never saw the real Clara, the brilliant, passionate, and resilient woman underneath. Her triumph wasn't walking in on the arm of a billionaire. It was walking in as herself, confident in her own worth, a worth she had rediscovered and rebuilt on her own terms. The billionaire didn't save her. He simply had the wisdom to recognize the masterpiece that was already there. If this story of triumph and self-worth resonated with you, and if you believe that our greatest strength is found in rediscovering who we truly are, then please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who might need to hear this message, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more true life stories that inspire and empower. Thank you for listening.
The gavel fell its sharp crack, lost in the cavernous silence of the ornate courtroom. All eyes were on Thomas Braddock, a man whose expensive suit couldn't conceal the ugliness twisting his handsome features. He pointed a trembling manicured finger not at the opposing counsel, but at his own pregnant wife, Felicia. She was a mistake, He spat the venomous words echoing off the polished marble. A disastrous, regrettable mistake. And that thing she's carrying is a mistake I refuse to pay for. A wave of gasps rippled through the gallery. But the real drama wasn't in his calculated cruelty. It was in the worn, leather-bound folder the judge had just placed on his bench, a folder containing the last will and testament of the one man Thomas could never bully his late father. The air in courtroom 4B of the San Mateo County Superior Court was thick with the perfume of old money and fresh animosity. It was a sterile, impersonal space, all mahogany panels and muted grey carpeting, yet it had become the arena for the deeply personal evisceration of a marriage. Felicia Vale, soon to be she hoped, Felicia Vale once more sat ramrod straight in her cushioned chair. Her hands resting protectively over the pronounced swell of her stomach were the only part of her that betrayed the tremor running through her body. At 32, she still possessed the quiet, bookish beauty that had first caught Thomas Braddock's eye. Thoughtful grey eyes, a cascade of chestnut hair she'd simply pinned back, and a complexion that had never needed the heavy-handed ministrations of the Braddock family's preferred aestheticians. Today, however, that beauty was shadowed by a weariness that went bone deep. She felt less like a person and more like a legal exhibit, the pregnant wife. Across the aisle, Thomas Braddock sat flanked by his lawyer, a shark in a Savile Row suit named Sterling, and his mother, Isabella Braddock. Thomas was the picture of wounded pride, his jaw tight, his brow furrowed in a performance of aggrieved masculinity. He was, Felicia had once thought, devastatingly handsome. Now she saw the weakness in his chin, the petulance in the downturn of his lips. He was a boy playing at being a king, and his mother Isabella was the silent, unyielding power behind the throne. Isabella Braddock was a masterpiece of preserved aristocracy. Her silver hair was coiffed into a helmet of glacial perfection. Her pearls were real, her Chanel suit was vintage, and her disdain was palpable. She hadn't looked at Felicia once, preferring to stare at the judge as if he were a tardy waiter. From the moment Thomas had brought Felicia home to the sprawling Braddock estate in Atherton, Isabella had treated her not as a future daughter-in-law, but as a hostile takeover bid. Felicia wasn't old money. Her father was a history professor, her mother a librarian. To the Braddocks, whose wealth stretched back to the railroad barons, Felicia was a curious little commoner, a temporary amusement for their heir. Mr. Braddock, Judge Albright, said, his voice a low gravel that commanded attention. He was a man in his 60s, with a weary face that had seen every flavor of human depravity. We are here to discuss the division of assets in your divorce proceedings. Let's try to maintain a certain level of decorum. Thomas's lawyer, Mr. Sterling, rose smoothly. Your Honor, my client's emotional state is merely a reflection of the deep betrayal he has suffered. He entered into this marriage in good faith, only to find Felicia's lawyer, a kind but firm woman named Maria Davies, cut him off. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is testifying. The betrayal Mr. Sterling refers to is my client's discovery that the prenuptial agreement Mr. Braddock forced upon her was not only unconscionable, but deliberately misleading. The prenup. The infamous document Isabella had presented to Felicia a week before the wedding. It had been an ambush styled as a casual chat over tea in the solarium. Just a formality, dear, Isabella had purred, sliding the thick document across the glass table. A way to keep things tidy. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings down the line. Thomas had backed his mother, of course. "It's just how things are done, Ellie," he'd said, avoiding her eyes. "It doesn't mean anything." It had meant everything. It had stipulated that in the event of a divorce, Felicia would walk away with nothing. Not a penny of the Braddock fortune, no claim to their properties, not even alimony. At the time, blinded by love and a naive belief in their future, she had signed it. Now, with a child on the way, a Braddock heir, the document was a cudgel they were using to beat her into submission. They offered her a one-time payout of $50,000 and a non-disclosure agreement so restrictive it would essentially erase her from their history. The validity of the prenuptial agreement is what we are here to debate. Judge Albright stated, his gaze fixed on Thomas. "But your personal feelings about your wife are for the moment irrelevant." This seemed to be the wrong thing to say. Thomas, who had been simmering, suddenly boiled over. He stood up, knocking his chair back slightly. "Irrelevant," he scoffed, his voice rising. "She is the most relevant mistake I've ever made. I was trapped. My father was ill, he was fond of her for some reason, and I went along with it." He gestured wildly towards Felicia. "She's a gold digger, Your Honor. A clever little parasite who saw a meal ticket and latched on." Maria Davies was on her feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." But the judge simply raised a hand, silencing her. He was watching Thomas, his expression unreadable. And Thomas, emboldened by the attention, took a step forward. He locked eyes with Felicia, and the mask of the charming, carefree man she had married fell away completely, revealing the snarling, entitled creature beneath. "Do you know what she did?" He addressed the judge, but his words were daggers aimed at her heart. "She got pregnant on purpose. After I told her we should wait. After I told her things were not working out. She did it to trap me to try and secure a piece of my family's legacy." Felicia felt the blood drain from her face. It was a lie. A vicious, calculated lie. They had been trying for a baby. It was Thomas who had been excited, who had talked about names, who had held her, and whispered dreams of their future family into her hair. That was before his father Arthur Braddock had passed away 2 months ago. Before Isabella had sunk her claws back into her son's soul. Then came the words that would be seared into her memory forever. Thomas's voice dropped, becoming low and guttural, dripping with a contempt so profound it physically hurt her. "She was a mistake," he repeated, pointing at her belly. "And that thing she's carrying is a mistake I refuse to pay for." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Felicia felt it like a physical blow. The baby inside her, their child, kicked as if in protest. Tears welled hot and fast, blurring the cruel face of the man she had loved. She saw Isabella smirk, a flicker of triumphant malice. This was what they wanted. To break her. To humiliate her so completely she would crawl away and accept their scraps. "That is enough." "Mr. Braddock." Judge Albright's voice was no longer weary. It was thunder. He slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing the shattering of Felicia's world. "That is more than enough. You will sit down now." Thomas, looking slightly stunned by his own outburst, sank back into his chair, though his hateful glare remained fixed on Felicia. Judge Albright surveyed the scene, his eyes lingering on Felicia's tear-streaked face, then on Isabella's smug one. He took a deep, steadying breath and squared a stack of papers on his bench. "This court is in recess for 15 minutes, he announced. "However, before we break, a matter has been brought to my attention this morning by the executor of the late Arthur Braddock's estate." At the mention of his father, Thomas sat up straighter. A flicker of something confusion, perhaps apprehension, crossed his face. The judge picked up the worn, leather-bound folder. It appears that Mr. Arthur Braddock's final will and testament, executed 1 month prior to his death, contains certain stipulations that have a direct and material bearing on the assets currently under discussion in this divorce. With the executor's permission, and given its relevance, I am unsealing it now. He opened the folder. The silence in the courtroom returned, but this time it was different. It was thick with confusion and a dawning electric tension. A will Arthur's will had been read weeks ago. It was simple, leaving everything to his only son Thomas, with a generous trust for Isabella. What was this? Felicia wiped her tears, her heart pounding a strange new rhythm. Arthur. Kind, gentle Arthur. He had been the only Braddock who had ever truly seen her, the only one who had ever been on her side. In his final months, as his illness worsened, he would often ask her to sit with him in the garden, away from the oppressive gloom of the mansion and the even more oppressive presence of his wife. They would talk for hours about history, about books, about her dreams for the future. He seemed to understand her in a way Thomas never had. "What is the meaning of this, Your Honor?" Mr. Sterling asked, his composure ruffled for the first time. "A new will." "We were not informed," it would seem Mr. Sterling, the judge, said, peering over his spectacles at the document, that no one was. Arthur Braddock was a very thorough man. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room, and began to read. As Judge Albright's voice began to drone through the legalese of the will's preamble, Felicia's mind spun backwards, away from the sterile cruelty of the courtroom to the sun-dappled lawns of the Braddock estate. She remembered the first time she'd met Arthur Braddock. It was 1.5 years ago. Thomas had brought her to the family's annual summer gala, a lavish affair of champagne fountains and string quartets. She'd been terrified a simple librarian's daughter adrift in a sea of couture and condescension. Isabella had introduced her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her tone making Felicia Vale sound like a quaint, unlisted company. Felicia had escaped to the rose garden, overwhelmed when she found a man in a tweed jacket, his back to her, carefully pruning a climbing rose. He turned, and his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held a warmth that was entirely absent from the main party. This was Arthur Braddock. "Ah, you've found my hiding spot," he'd said with a gentle smile. "Don't worry, I won't tell if you don't." They talked for nearly an hour. He didn't ask about her family's money or connections. He asked what she was reading. He asked about her work at the San Francisco Public Library, his face lighting up when she described her passion for historical archives. He spoke of his own love for history, a passion he lamented his son did not share. "Thomas sees history as a list of assets acquired," Arthur had said, with a sad, knowing sigh. "He sees the names Rockefeller, Carnegie, Braddock. But he doesn't understand the stories, the humanity." In that single conversation, Arthur had shown her more genuine interest and kindness than Isabella had in 6 months of strained dinners. He saw her not as an attachment to his son, but as a person. Over the next year, he became her quiet ally in the gilded cage of the Braddock family. While Isabella laid subtle traps and Thomas grew more distant under his mother's influence, Arthur would seek Felicia out. He'd leave a rare first-edition book on her bedside table or invite her to walk the grounds, sharing stories of the family that were not about wealth, but about love, loss, and folly. He was already ill then, a creeping lung disease that stole his breath but never his sharp intellect. As his condition worsened, The dynamic in the house shifted. Isabella became more controlling, treating her husband's illness as an inconvenience and tightening her grip on Thomas. The pregnancy had been a brief, shining moment of hope. Thomas had been ecstatic at first. It was his idea, a way to, as he'd put it, finally start our own family away from all the pressure. They'd celebrated with a trip to Big Sur, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the estate. He had put his hands on her still flat stomach and spoken of a future that felt real and full of love. The moment they returned, Isabella shattered it. Felicia overheard the argument from the top of the grand staircase. A baby. Isabella's voice was like ice. "Now, Thomas, you are an imbecile. You have no idea what you've done." "Mother, it's my child. Our child. I love Ellie." "Love," she'd scoffed. "You are infatuated with a librarian, Thomas, a nobody. And now she has tethered herself to our legacy with the oldest trick in the book. Do you think for 1 second she wasn't planning this? To tie you down, to make herself indispensable." The poison took root quickly. Thomas began to pull away. He started spending more time at the office, coming home late, smelling of expensive whiskey and another woman's perfume. The excuses were flimsy, the apologies hollow. He grew short-tempered, echoing his mother's criticisms. He'd comment on Felicia's clothes, her friends, her lack of ambition. Then Arthur's health took a steep decline. In his last weeks, he was confined to his bed. The house was somber and quiet. Isabella managed his care with ruthless efficiency, keeping visitors to a minimum. But Arthur would still ask for Felicia. One afternoon, just a month before he died, he beckoned her close. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were lucid. "Felicia," he rasped, taking her hand. His own was frail, all paper-thin skin and bone. "Don't let them break you. You have more strength than any of them." He'd looked pointedly at her stomach. "And you have a responsibility to that child, a responsibility to be strong." He'd made her promise. She hadn't understood the full weight of his words then. 2 weeks later, he summoned his personal attorney, a man Felicia had never met, to the house. Isabella had been furious, trying to insist that the family lawyer, Mr. Sterling, be present. Arthur, with a surprising burst of strength, had refused. "This is a private matter, Isabella," he'd said. The meeting had lasted for 3 hours. The next day, Arthur seemed more at peace. He passed away in his sleep a month later. The first reading of the will had been exactly what everyone expected. A simple document leaving Braddock Enterprises and the bulk of the estate to Thomas. Isabella was granted a lifelong right to live in the family mansion and a generous stipend from a separate trust. It was so straightforward that Thomas had smirked a look of vindicated relief on his face. With his father gone, the final obstacle to his absolute inheritance and Isabella's absolute influence was removed. 2 days after that, Thomas had asked for a divorce. The words were cold, rehearsed. He'd said the marriage was a mistake, that he'd been pressured by his father's failing health. He presented it as a clean break, a return to the natural order of things. When Felicia, heartbroken and 7 months pregnant, had refused to be discarded so easily, he had turned vicious. The battle over the prenup began, and now here they were. A sharp intake of breath from Mr. Sterling snapped Felicia back to the present. Judge Albright had finished with the preliminary sections of the will. His eyes scanned the room before continuing. "We now come to Article 4. The judge said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing every ounce of attention in the room. "Regarding the disposition of my primary asset, My controlling interest in Braddock Enterprises Incorporated. Thomas leaned forward, a smug look returning to his face. This was it, the confirmation of his kingdom. I, Arthur Braddock, the judge read his voice, clear and deliberate, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare the following. My son Thomas Braddock has in recent months shown a lamentable lack of judgment and a character ill-suited to the stewardship of the company my grandfather built. A jolt went through the room. Thomas's face went from smug to slack-jawed shock. Isabella's carefully constructed composure cracked her mouth, falling open slightly. What Thomas whispered the word stolen by the cavernous room. The judge continued, his voice unwavering. He has proven himself to be easily manipulated and has forgotten the most fundamental principle of our family's success, that our name is built on integrity, not just on assets. Therefore, I cannot in good conscience deliver the future of Braddock Enterprises into his hands. This is insane, Sterling blurted out, rising to his feet. Your Honor, my client's father was clearly not of sound mind. He was heavily medicated. He was certified of sound mind by 2 independent physicians the day this will was signed, Mr. Sterling. Their affidavits are attached, Judge Albright said coolly, not even looking up. Now sit down. Sterling sank back into his chair, his face pale. The judge's eyes found Felicia's across the room. She held his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. He went on. Therefore, I hereby bequeath my entire controlling share of Braddock Enterprises, representing 51% of the voting stock, not to my son, but to a trust. This trust shall be known as the Arthur Vale Braddock Legacy Trust. Vale. He had used her maiden name. A low guttural sound escaped Isabella's throat. The judge continued reading the clause that would change everything. The sole beneficiary of this trust is to be my first-born grandchild, the child currently carried by my daughter-in-law, Felicia Vale Braddock. The courtroom devolved into a cacophony of frantic whispers. Thomas looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He stared at Felicia's belly, not with contempt, but with a dawning, horrified awe. That mistake was now the majority shareholder of his entire inheritance. But Arthur Braddock wasn't finished. The final killing blow was yet to come. Judge Albright looked up from the document, his gaze passing over Thomas and Isabella, before settling once more on Felicia. He read the last sentence of the article, his voice ringing with a profound posthumous finality. The sole executor and trustee of this trust, vested with absolute and unconditional authority over all voting rights, board appointments, and financial decisions of Braddock Enterprises, until the beneficiary reaches the age of 25, shall be the child's mother, and my trusted daughter-in-law, Felicia Vale Braddock. For a long moment, the world stopped. The frantic whispers died. The rustling of papers ceased. The only sound in courtroom 4B was the frantic, trapped beat of Felicia's own heart. She stared at Judge Albright, certain she had misheard, that the grief and stress had finally caused her to hallucinate. Sole executor and trustee. Absolute and unconditional authority. The words didn't compute. They were abstract alien concepts that didn't belong to her. Felicia Vale, the librarian, the spurned wife, the humiliated mother-to-be. Then the spell broke. A strangled cry tore from Isabella Braddock's throat. It was a sound of pure, undiluted fury, the cry of a queen who has just watched her castle crumble into dust. "No, it's a lie, a forgery!" she shrieked, lurching to her feet. Her mask of aristocratic control was gone, replaced by a visage of raw, twitching rage. That woman, that scheming little harlot, she manipulated him. She poisoned my husband against his own family. Mr. Sterling, his face the color of ash, tried to restrain her, whispering urgently, "Isabella not here. Control yourself." But she was beyond control. She pointed a trembling, diamond-clad finger at Felicia. This was your plan all along. You seduced a dying old man, twisted his mind. Mrs. Braddock. Judge Albright's voice cracked like a whip. You are on the verge of being held in contempt. Another outburst like that, and you will be removed by the bailiff. Isabella snapped her mouth shut, but her chest heaved, and her eyes fixed on Felicia promised retribution. Thomas was eerily silent. He sat frozen, his body rigid, his eyes wide and vacant. He was staring at the polished table in front of him, but he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing his entire world, the one he had been promised from birth, vanish before his eyes. The kingdom he was meant to inherit, the power he was meant to wield, had just been handed lock, stock, and barrel to the woman he had publicly disavowed, and the unborn child he had branded a mistake. Felicia's lawyer, Maria Davies, leaned over her, voice a low, steady murmur in Felicia's ear. "Felicia, did you hear that? Do you understand what this means?" Felicia could only shake her head slowly, her mind a whirlwind of shock. She looked from Thomas's shattered expression to Isabella's murderous glare. She felt a kick, a strong, solid thump from within, a reminder of the tiny, unknowing beneficiary at the center of this cataclysm. Judge Albright, seemingly unfazed by the eruption, continued as if reading a grocery list. "The will goes on to state," he said, his voice cutting through the residual tension, "that Thomas Braddock is to be granted a salaried position as President of Operations, reporting directly to the Board of Directors. A board that the new trustee," he paused, looking directly at Felicia, "has the sole authority to appoint or dismiss." The implication was brutally clear. Thomas was no longer the heir apparent. He was an employee who could be fired. By her. Furthermore, the judge added, the will stipulates that Thomas Braddock and Isabella Braddock are permitted to maintain residence in the Atherton family home, but only with the express ongoing permission of the trustee. The deed and title of the property are to be transferred to the Arthur Vale Braddock Legacy Trust. They were tenants in their own home. Their right to live there was now entirely at Felicia's discretion. The finality of it was absolute. Arthur hadn't just disinherited his son. He had orchestrated a complete coup d'etat from beyond the grave. He had seen the cruelty, the weakness, the greed, and he had built a fortress to protect his grandchild and the woman he believed could safeguard his legacy. He hadn't just given Felicia a shield, he had given her a sword, an arsenal, an entire kingdom. The will Judge Albright concluded, closing the leather folder with a soft thud, is accompanied by a signed and notarized letter from Arthur Braddock detailing his reasons. It explains his concerns over his son's profligate spending, his susceptibility to his mother's corrosive influence, and his cruel and dishonorable treatment of his pregnant wife. The letter states, and I quote, "I have observed Felicia for 2 years. She possesses an integrity my son sorely lacks. She is intelligent, compassionate, and her loyalty is not to money but to family. I do not give her this power to punish my son, but to protect my grandchild. I trust her to do what is right." The judge looked at Thomas. "The letter also expresses hope, Mr. Braddock, that this drastic but necessary action will provide you with an opportunity to rediscover the man you were meant to be, not the man your mother wants you to be." That last line was a dagger meant for Isabella, and it hit its mark. She flinched as if struck. Judge Albright removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Given these revelations," he stated, his voice returning to its official, dispassionate tone, "the financial landscape of this divorce has been fundamentally altered. The prenuptial agreement is now entirely moot, as the primary assets Mr. Braddock believed were his to protect are in fact not his. The $50,000 settlement offered to Mrs. Braddock is, to put it mildly, insufficient." He looked at Felicia, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something almost like a smile in his tired eyes. "In fact, Mrs. Braddock is now, for all intents and purposes, the single most powerful financial entity in this room. The assets belong to the trust she controls." He turned to the stunned lawyers. "I am dissolving these proceedings for today. I suggest you all go home, absorb the contents of this will, and reschedule when you have a more realistic grasp of your clients' respective situations. Mr. Sterling," he added pointedly, "you may want to advise your client that his wife's mistake now controls his salary, his home, and his future. A bit of humility might be in order." With a final sharp rap of the gavel, he declared, "Court is adjourned." The judge rose and swept out of the room, leaving a vortex of stunned silence in his wake. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, chaos erupted. Reporters who had been lurking in the gallery rushed towards the doors. Sterling was frantically trying to speak to Thomas, who was still catatonic. Maria Davies was patting Felicia's shoulder, her face a mixture of shock and elation. Felicia slowly got to her feet, her legs unsteady. She felt dizzy, disconnected from her own body. Isabella was the first to move towards her, her face a terrifying mask of fury. She stalked across the aisle, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. "You will not get away with this," Isabella hissed, her voice low and venomous, close enough for Felicia to smell her cloyingly expensive perfume. "I will fight this. I will prove you are an unfit mother. I will drag your name through so much mud you'll drown in it. That baby will never see a penny." Before Felicia could react, a figure stepped between them. It was Thomas. His face was ashen, his eyes wild with a desperate, frantic energy. He looked from his mother to Felicia, then back again. "Mother, stop," he said, his voice hoarse. "Just stop." He then turned to Felicia. The contempt was gone, replaced by a raw, pleading panic. The man who not 20 minutes ago had called her and their child a mistake now looked at her as if she were a lifeline. "Ellie," he began, his voice cracking. He even reached a hand out as if to touch her arm before letting it fall. "Ellie, I didn't mean it. You have to believe me. I was angry. I was pressured." His eyes flickered towards his mother. "We can fix this, you and me. We can stop the divorce. We can raise the baby together, in our house." The audacity of it was breathtaking. The whiplash of his transformation from tyrant to supplicant was so sudden it was nauseating. He wasn't apologizing for the cruelty. He was trying to reverse a transaction that had gone horribly wrong for him. He didn't see a wife he had wounded. He saw the new CEO of his life. Felicia looked at his desperate, pleading face. She looked at Isabella, who was watching them with narrowed, calculating eyes, her mind already plotting new strategies. And she felt nothing. Not love, not hate, not even anger anymore. Just a profound, chilling emptiness where her love for him used to be. She looked at his outstretched, trembling hand. Then she looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and steady for the first time that day. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving her husband and his mother standing in the ruins of their fallen kingdom. Her lawyer Maria rushed to her side, and together they walked out of the courtroom. Not towards a miserable, uncertain future, but towards an empire Felicia had never asked for, but now, by the grace of a good man's final act, commanded. The days that followed the courtroom bombshell were a blur of surreal adjustments. Felicia didn't return to the small rented apartment she had secured as a refuge from her marriage. Maria Davies had insisted it wasn't secure enough. "You're not just a private citizen anymore, Felicia," she'd said, her tone urgent. "You are the head of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. There are protocols now." And so Felicia found herself in a gilded prison of a different sort, a penthouse suite at the Four Seasons paid for by the Arthur Vale Braddock Legacy Trust, with a round-the-clock security detail stationed in the hallway, lawyers, trust officers, and financial advisors. Men and women with sharp suits and even sharper minds. All remnants of Arthur's loyal inner circle paraded through her living room. They presented her with binders thick with financial reports, organizational charts, and legal obligations. They used terms like fiduciary duty, hostile takeover defenses, and quarterly earnings projections. At first, it was overwhelmingly intimidating. She was Felicia Vale, who found comfort in the Dewey Decimal System, not the Dow Jones Industrial Average. But as they spoke, she listened. She asked questions, simple ones at first, then more complex ones. And she discovered something surprising. The logic of it, the intricate web of cause and effect, wasn't so different from tracing historical events or archival records. It was a story just told in the language of numbers. More importantly, she was fueled by a powerful clarifying force, the memory of Arthur's words, "I trust her to do what is right," and the visceral, soul-crushing memory of Thomas's "that thing she's carrying is a mistake." One was a sacred trust, the other a declaration of war. She would honor the former by prevailing in the latter. Her phone rang incessantly. The calls were from Thomas. He left dozens of voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. They were a pathetic symphony of panicked apologies and self-serving promises. "Ellie, baby, please pick up. I'm so sorry. I've been such a fool. My mother, she gets in my head. But that's over now, I swear. I was just looking at the crib we ordered. Remember the one from that little shop in Carmel? It's all about us, Ellie. You, me, and our little boy. Or girl. It's all that matters. I told Sterling to fire his legal team. We don't need lawyers. We're a family. Just come home. Please, just come home, and we can figure this all out." She never answered. She never listened to a single message, twice. It was the desperate pleading of a man who had lost his wallet, not a husband who had broken his wife's heart. Isabella, for her part, had gone to ground, but it was a tactical silence, not a surrender. Maria's legal team reported that Isabella had hired a new, notoriously aggressive law firm, specializing in contesting wills. They were digging, searching for any doctor who would testify to Arthur's incompetence, any nurse who would claim Felicia had restricted access to him, any scrap of dirt they could find, to paint her as a manipulative usurper. A week after the hearing, Felicia knew she couldn't stay in the hotel forever. She had to make a move. The trust owned the Braddock mansion. It was her house now. More importantly, it was her child's house. Arthur had not intended for his grandchild to be raised in exile. So she made a decision. She called Maria. "I'm going home," she said, her voice firm. "Felicia is that wise. It's not about wisdom, Maria. It's about a clear message. The Queen is not in hiding. The return was as dramatic as she had intended. She didn't sneak in the back door. She arrived in a black town car, arranged by the trust, which swept up the long gravel driveway to the imposing facade of the Atherton mansion. As she stepped out of the car, the heavy front doors opened. Thomas stood there, his face a mixture of hope and terror. He had clearly been watching for her. He was dressed down in a cashmere sweater, an attempt to look soft, approachable. "Ellie." He breathed a relieved smile, touching his lips. "You're home." "I am," Felicia said, her tone cool and level. She walked past him into the cavernous marble-floored foyer. The air was still and smelled of lemon polish and lilies, just as it always had. "I've asked a moving company to clear out my old things from the guest wing. They will be delivering my new furniture for the nursery this afternoon." Thomas's smile faltered. "Of course, anything you want. I had Mrs. Albright air out the master suite for you. For us." Felicia stopped and turned to him. "Let's be very clear, Thomas. I am not here to reconcile. I am here because this is my home now. It belongs to the trust that I command. You and your mother are living here at my discretion." The words hung in the air, cold and hard. The color drained from Thomas's face. "My legal team," she continued, her voice devoid of emotion, "will be drawing up a tenancy at will agreement for you and Isabella. It will stipulate the terms of your continued residence. Furthermore, I am calling a board meeting for Braddock Enterprises for Monday morning. As president of operations, your attendance will be required. You'll be expected to present a full report on the company's current standing." She was no longer his wife. She was his landlord and his boss. The reality of it slammed into him, and his composure finally shattered. "Felicia, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Don't do this. Don't be like this. This isn't you. You're not this cold." "You're right," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "The woman I was would have forgiven you. She would have believed your lies and let you hurt her again. But you and your mother killed that woman. You stood in a court of law, and you killed her. So you'll have to get used to the woman who is left." Just then a sharp, imperious voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Isabella stood there, wrapped in a silk dressing gown, her face a thunderous mask. Felicia didn't even grant her a full glance. "Hello, Isabella," she said, her voice carrying easily in the grand space. "I'm home. I trust your new lawyers have explained the situation to you. You're a guest here. Try not to forget it." She turned and began to walk towards the east wing, where Arthur's private study was located. It had been her sanctuary with him, and it would now be her command center. "You will regret this," Isabella shrieked from the landing. "I will see you on the street." Felicia paused, her back still to them. "No, you won't," she said without turning around. "You will see me in the boardroom, Monday at 9 a.m. Don't be late." And with that, she walked away, leaving mother and son standing in the opulent foyer of a house that was no longer theirs, silenced by the quiet, unshakable authority of the woman they had tried and failed to destroy. The following months were a masterclass in trench warfare, fought not with bullets, but with board appointments and legal briefs. Felicia, now 8 and then 9 months pregnant, moved not with the timid uncertainty of a librarian, but with the deliberate, focused strategy of a general. Arthur's study became her war room. Its rich, leather-bound books on military history and corporate biography now seemed less like a collection and more like a curated library of tactics left for her by a brilliant mentor. Her first move was the board meeting. She walked into the Braddock Enterprises boardroom, a long, intimidating chamber dominated by a colossal mahogany table and portraits of stern-faced Braddock men, and every head turned. The existing board members, all cronies of Thomas and Isabella, looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and thinly veiled contempt. Thomas sat at the head of the table, a place he had occupied for less than 3 months. Felicia, guided by Maria, and the Trust's chief counsel took the seat directly opposite him. She didn't claim his chair. She created a new center of power. She let Thomas run through his report, a rambling, jargon-filled presentation clearly designed to intimidate and confuse her. When he finished, he looked at her, a challenge in his eyes. Felicia didn't respond directly to his report. Instead, she introduced the Trust's counsel, who then calmly and methodically laid out the legal reality of the new ownership structure. Then Felicia spoke. "Thank you, Thomas, for that overview," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "In my capacity as trustee, my primary duty is to ensure the long-term health and integrity of this company for the sole beneficiary. To that end, I have spent the last week reviewing the company's performance, its leadership, and its vision, and I have found it lacking." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Effective immediately, I am exercising my authority as trustee to reconstitute the board of directors. Mr. Henderson, Ms. Albright, Mr. Chen," she said, naming 3 of Isabella's oldest and most loyal allies. "Your positions on this board are terminated. Thank you for your service." The 3 of them stared aghast. "You can't do that," one of them sputtered. "She can, and she has," the Trust's lawyer interjected smoothly. Felicia continued, her gaze sweeping the table. "In their place, I am appointing 3 new members. First, Ms. Maria Davies, whose legal expertise will be invaluable. Second, Mr. Alistair Finch." She named Arthur's longtime, fiercely loyal financial advisor, a man Isabella had forced into retirement. And third, Dr. Lena Petrova, a leading expert in sustainable business ethics from Stanford University. Arthur Braddock often spoke of creating a legacy, not just a profit margin. We will honor that vision. It was a coup. Clean, swift, and utterly devastating. She had decapitated Isabella's power base within the company in less than 5 minutes. Thomas sat impotent, watching his allies pack their briefcases in stunned silence. He was still president, but he was now a president who answered to a board that was loyal to her. Life in the mansion was a silent, cold war. Felicia took over the master wing, while Thomas and Isabella were confined to the guest suites. They shared the same roof, passed each other in the long hallways like ghosts, and ate meals at different times to avoid contact. Isabella's attempts at psychological warfare, leaving old happy photos of her and Thomas out making loud, pitying phone calls about poor, confused Felicia, were met with a wall of serene, impenetrable silence. Thomas, meanwhile, swung wildly between pathetic attempts at reconciliation and sullen resentment. He'd leave a single rose on her desk one day, and the next he'd make a sarcastic comment about her playing CEO at the dinner table. Felicia ignored it all. Her focus was singular, the baby and the business. She found an unexpected strength in the routine. She'd wake early, walk the gardens as she had with Arthur, and then spend hours with Alistair Finch, the reappointed advisor. He would patiently walk her through balance sheets and investment portfolios, marveling at her quick grasp of complex ideas. "Your father-in-law was right about you," he said one afternoon. "You have a formidable mind, Mrs. Braddock. You see the whole chessboard." The one front where Isabella believed she could still win was the legal challenge to the will. Her lawyers filed motion after motion, claiming undue influence and testamentary incapacity. They deposed nurses, gardeners, and cooks, searching for any hint that Felicia had manipulated a dying man. The case was set to be heard by Judge Albright once again. Isabella was confident. She believed, found a star witness, a disgruntled former nurse, whom Isabella had paid handsomely to testify that Felicia had constantly bad-mouthed Thomas and Isabella to Arthur, poisoning his mind in his final days. The day before the hearing, Felicia was in the nursery putting the finishing touches on the room. It was painted a soft, gentle yellow, with a mural of a forest scene on one wall. As she stood there, her hands on her huge belly, feeling the strong, steady kicks of her child, she felt a profound sense of peace. She was ready for whatever came next. That evening, a courier delivered a small sealed package to her. It was from Arthur's personal attorney, the executor of the estate. The accompanying note was brief. Arthur asked me to give this to you if Isabella ever formally contested the will. He called it insurance. Felicia's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was not a document, but a small, solid-state audio recorder and a single key. Confused, she pressed play. The voice that filled the silent room was Arthur's. It was weak, raspy, clearly recorded in his last weeks, but it was unmistakably him. "If you are hearing this, Felicia," the recording began, "it means Isabella is trying to undo my final wishes. I am not surprised. Her greed has always been her most defining trait. I want you and the court to know the truth." Arthur's recorded voice then detailed with painful clarity Isabella's emotional cruelty throughout their marriage, her constant manipulation of their son, and her open contempt for Felicia. He spoke of how Isabella had tried to bar Felicia from his room, how she had dismissed his doctors and tried to bring in her own specialists who would declare him incompetent. "But the most important evidence," Arthur's voice continued, "is not my words, but hers. Last week, she did not know I had my lawyer install a small recording device in this room, activated by voice. She came in, believing me to be asleep to speak with Thomas. They thought they were alone. The recording is on this device. The key is to my old safe in the study. The evidence inside will corroborate everything." Felicia's blood ran cold. She stopped the recording, her heart pounding. She took the small antique key, went to the study, and opened the safe she never knew existed, hidden behind a false panel of books. Inside was a folder. It contained copies of emails between Isabella and a private investigator she had hired to dig up dirt on Felicia a year ago. It contained financial records showing large payments to the disgruntled nurse. And it contained a second audio recorder. With a deep breath, she pressed play. This time the voices were clearer. It was Isabella and Thomas in Arthur's room, thinking he was sedated and unconscious. Isabella's voice was sharp, cutting. "You have to divorce her the moment he's gone, Thomas. Not a day later. Offer her a pittance. Humiliate her. Make her crawl back to whatever hovel she came from. We cannot have that common bloodline infecting this family." Then Thomas's voice, weak and compliant. "And the baby? What do I do about the baby?" "The baby is a non-issue," Isabella had replied coldly. "We'll claim she trapped you. We'll claim it might not even be yours. We will drag her through a custody battle that will break her. In the end, she'll give it all up just to have peace. The Braddock legacy will remain pure. Your father in his senile state may be fond of her, but we will protect our family from his sentimentality. Felicia sank into a chair, the audio recorder slipping from her fingers. It wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a confession. They had laid out their entire vicious plan in the presence of the very man whose legacy they sought to protect. She now held more than just a defense. She held a weapon of annihilation. The hearing was tomorrow, and she knew exactly what she was going to do. The morning of the hearing was grey and overcast. Isabella Braddock arrived looking imperious and confident, her paid star witness, Nurse Brenda, trailing in her wake. Thomas followed, looking haggard, a man caught in an inescapable vice. Felicia entered last, calm and composed, carrying a simple leather briefcase. Isabella's lawyer, Fletcher, called his witness. Nurse Brenda took the stand and delivered a tearful, practiced performance, painting Felicia as a cunning manipulator who had poisoned a dying, vulnerable Arthur against his loving family. She would whisper insults about Mrs. Braddock and Thomas for hours, the nurse claimed, dabbing a fake tear. She twisted his every thought. It was heartbreaking. When it was Maria Davies's turn, she approached the stand with lethal calm. "Nurse Brenda," she began, "aside from your salary, were you paid any other amounts by Isabella Braddock? Specifically, a sum of $250,000 transferred to an offshore account 2 days after Arthur Braddock's death." The nurse's face went white. Fletcher shot to his feet, shouting objections, but Judge Albright overruled him instantly. "Answer the question, Nurse Brenda." The witness stammered, her lies collapsing under the weight of a single damning question. But this was only the opening salvo. At a nod from Maria, Felicia stood the proud swell of her pregnancy, a silent testament to everything at stake. "Your Honor," Felicia said, her voice ringing with newfound strength, "I would like to present new evidence that will clarify the true nature of the influence surrounding Arthur Braddock in his final days." She opened her briefcase and removed a small audio recorder. "This is a recording made by my father-in-law himself. He left it for me in the event of this exact scenario." She pressed play. Arthur's weak, rasping voice filled the stunned courtroom. He spoke of his faith in Felicia's character and his deep disappointment in his son and wife. A visible shockwave went through the room when he mentioned a second recording, one he had secretly made, of Isabella and Thomas. Isabella's face contorted a mask of dawning horror. "And now," Felicia said, her voice cold as steel, as she held up the second device, the conversation Arthur spoke of, recorded in his room when they believed he was unconscious. She pressed play again. The courtroom was plunged into a chilling silence, broken only by the recorded voices of mother and son plotting Felicia's destruction. Isabella's voice, crisp and cruel. "You have to divorce her the moment he's gone. Humiliate her. Make her crawl. We cannot have that common bloodline infecting this family." Then Thomas, weak and complicit. "And the baby. What do I do about the baby?" And the final monstrous words from Isabella. "The baby is a non-issue. We'll claim it might not even be yours. We will drag her through a custody battle that will break her." The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute and condemning. Isabella was frozen in her chair, her face a grotesque tableau of public exposure and private ruin. Thomas had buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. His lawyer sat down, utterly defeated. Judge Albright stared at Isabella, his face a mask of cold fury. "Mrs. Braddock," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "what you have just heard in your own words is a monstrous conspiracy to commit perjury and destroy an innocent woman. And you, he said, turning his glare on Thomas, your cowardice is contemptible. He slammed his gavel, the sound like a gunshot. The challenge to this will is dismissed with extreme prejudice. I am fining Mrs. Isabella Braddock $500,000 for malicious prosecution. And I am forwarding this audio evidence to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into potential criminal charges. His expression softened only when he looked at Felicia. Mrs. Braddock, you have endured a trial by fire and proven your father-in-law's faith in you was not misplaced. You are free. It was over. Complete victory. As the court adjourned, Thomas finally lifted his head, his face ravaged by tears. He looked at Felicia, his eyes a bottomless well of self-loathing, knowing no words could ever bridge the chasm he had created. Felicia met his gaze not with triumph, but with a quiet, somber finality. She gave a single nod, an acknowledgement of the tragedy he had authored, then turned and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. 2 weeks later, Felicia gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. She named him Arthur. The day she brought him home, the mansion felt different. Isabella was gone, having retreated to await the results of the DA's investigation. Thomas remained a ghost in the guest wing. Felicia stood in the grand foyer, holding her tiny son. She looked up at the portrait of the first Arthur Braddock, then at the empty, faded space on the wall where Isabella's portrait used to hang. The house was no longer a cage or a battlefield. It was a sanctuary. It was home. Her son Arthur Vale Braddock cooed in his sleep, his tiny hand wrapped securely around her finger. He was not a mistake. He was a legacy. And she was his guardian. The past was a story of pain, but the future was hers to write. From courtroom humiliation to the head of an empire, Felicia Braddock's journey is a breathtaking saga of karmic justice. A husband's cruelty sparked his own downfall, but a father's final act of love provided the ultimate checkmate. She didn't just win her freedom, she inherited a fortune and proved that true power comes from character, not just a name. If you were moved by Felicia's incredible triumph, hit that like button to show your support. Share this story of empowerment with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another video where justice is finally served.